Elena Voss felt the bond snap before she understood what was happening. One moment she was standing under the silver light of the full moon, surrounded by hundreds of pack members dressed in ceremonial white, and the next moment, a wave of pain tore through her chest so violently that her knees buckled. She grabbed the stone altar beside her to keep from falling, and the crowd around her went silent. Marcus Cole stood only 10 feet away from her, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the dark formal coat that marked him as the future alpha of the Blackwood Pack. Just seconds earlier, the pack elder had spoken the ancient words that revealed what everyone could sense, but no one had said aloud. Elena was his fated mate. The moon had chosen her. The bond had already begun to form between them, a thread of warmth that had been growing in her chest from the moment their eyes met across the ceremony grounds. Then Marcus opened his mouth and destroyed it. "I reject this bond," he said, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear. "I will not take Elena Voss as my mate." The words landed like a blow. Elena felt the thread inside her chest go cold, then twist, then rip apart entirely. She had never experienced physical pain like it before. It was as if something essential had been carved out of her body, leaving a hollow space where warmth used to be. She pressed a hand to her sternum, gasping, and around her the pack members began to whisper. Marcus did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the elder, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Elena searched his face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt, but she found none. He looked like a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the ceremony to end so he could walk away from it. "The alliance with House Nightshade has already been agreed upon," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I will marry Princess Serafina. This union with Elena Voss cannot proceed." Somewhere near the back of the gathering, Elena heard someone gasp her name. She recognized the voice as belonging to her closest friend, Grace Hollis, but she could not turn to look. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred at the edges, and the only thing keeping her upright was sheer stubbornness. She thought about the years she had known Marcus, not as a mate, not as anything more than a fellow pack member who occasionally nodded to her in passing. She had never imagined that the moon would choose him for her, and clearly, standing here now, he had never wanted to be chosen at all. The public rejection was not simply a personal wound. Within pack law, it was a humiliation with no equal. Every wolf present would remember this moment. Every wolf present would know that Marcus had looked at his own fated mate and decided she was not worth the cost of walking away from a political marriage. Elena forced herself to lift her chin. She would not collapse in front of the entire pack. She would not give Marcus Cole the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. The elder, an older woman named Constance Ward who had presided over dozens of moon ceremonies, looked between the two of them with an expression Elena could not quite read. Sympathy, perhaps, mixed with something like disappointment. "The rejection is recorded," Constance said quietly. "Elena Voss, you are released from any obligation to this bond. The pain will fade in time." It did not feel like it would ever fade. Elena's whole body ached, as if she had been struck by a car and left in the road. She managed one look at Marcus before she turned to leave, and in that single glance, she saw something she had not expected. For just a moment, his composure cracked. His eyes met hers, and there was something like regret buried beneath the hard mask of duty. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same unreadable expression he had worn since the ceremony began. Elena did not wait to see if he would say anything else. She turned and walked through the crowd, her spine straight, her steps even, refusing to run even though every instinct told her to flee. People parted to let her through, some offering quiet words of sympathy, others simply staring with open curiosity. She heard murmurs following her, comments about Princess Serafina, about the alliance with House Nightshade, about how fortunate Marcus was to secure such a valuable union, despite the cost of rejecting his own mate. By the time she reached the edge of the ceremony grounds, tears were streaming down her face, hot and humiliating. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of anyone, and she kept that promise only by the narrowest margin, waiting until she was surrounded by trees and darkness before she finally let herself break. She sank onto the forest floor, her back against the rough bark of an old oak tree, and pressed both hands against her chest as if she could physically hold herself together. The pain of the rejected bond throbbed beneath her ribs, sharp and unrelenting, a constant reminder of what had just been taken from her, before she had even had the chance to understand what it meant. Footsteps approached through the underbrush, light and hurried. Grace appeared through the trees, her ceremonial dress catching on branches as she pushed her way toward Elena. She dropped to her knees beside her friend without hesitation, wrapping her arms around Elena's shaking shoulders. "I am so sorry," Grace whispered. "I cannot believe he did that. In front of everyone." Elena could not speak for a long moment. She simply let herself be held, let herself cry, until the worst of it passed, until her breathing steadied, and the sharp edges of the pain dulled into something more like a bruise. "He didn't even hesitate," Elena finally managed to say. "He looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like I was something standing between him and what he actually wanted." "Princess Serafina," Grace said, her voice tight with disgust. "Her family controls half the northern territories. This marriage secures Blackwood's position for the next generation. Everyone has known about the arrangement for months. I just never imagined the moon would choose you as his mate at the same time." "Neither did I." Elena wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I never asked for this. I never wanted to be tied to Marcus Cole. But being rejected like that, in front of everyone, it feels like being told I was never worth considering in the first place." Grace squeezed her shoulder. "You are worth more than any political alliance. Marcus is going to regret this. I promise you that." Elena did not believe her, not in that moment. All she could think about was the hollow space in her chest, where something warm had briefly existed, and how quickly it had been ripped away by a man who had barely looked at her twice before tonight. They sat together in the darkness for a long while, the sounds of the ceremony fading into the distance, as the pack moved on, to celebrate the announcement of Marcus and Serafina's engagement. Elena could hear faint music, drifting through the trees, laughter, the clink of celebratory drinks. The pack was moving forward without her, already treating the rejection as old news, already looking ahead to the wedding that would secure their future. "I need to leave," Elena said suddenly. Grace pulled back to look at her. "Leave the ceremony? We already have." "No." Elena shook her head, feeling a strange clarity settle over her, despite the lingering ache in her chest. "I need to leave Blackwood territory. I cannot stay here and watch him build a life with someone else. I cannot stay here and be the woman everyone whispers about, the mate who wasn't good enough. Elena, this is your home. Your family is here. My family will understand." Elena's voice grew steadier with each word, as if the decision itself was giving her strength. "I love my parents, but I cannot heal here. Every time I walk through this territory, I will be reminded of what happened tonight. I need to build a life, somewhere Marcus Cole's name means nothing to me." "Then I will help you pack. Where will you go?" Elena had not thought that far ahead, not really, but the answer came to her almost immediately, as if some part of her had already been planning an escape long before tonight's ceremony. Somewhere neutral, a city maybe. Somewhere without pack politics, without territory lines, without anyone who knows what happened here tonight. "That sounds lonely." "Maybe," Elena admitted, "but it sounds better than staying here and being pitied for the rest of my life." They walked back toward the pack houses together, taking a wide path around the ceremony grounds to avoid the lingering celebration. Elena caught glimpses of firelight through the trees, heard fragments of conversation about the upcoming wedding, about how quickly the arrangements would need to be finalized now that the engagement had been formally announced. Each word felt like a small stone thrown at her already bruised heart, but she kept walking, kept her eyes forward, refusing to let herself look back toward the fire where Marcus stood beside his future bride. That night, Elena packed only what she could carry. She left behind furniture, books, most of her clothing, keeping only the essentials and the few possessions that held real sentimental value. Her parents, when she told them her plan the following morning, were shocked, but ultimately supportive. Her mother cried. Her father held her tightly and told her that no matter where she went, she would always have a place to return to. "I'm not running away forever," Elena told them, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was true. "I just need distance. I need to figure out who I am, outside of what happened last night." Within 3 days, Elena had arranged transportation to a city several hours from Blackwood territory, a place with no pack affiliation, no wolves she recognized, no history that could follow her through the streets. She rented a small apartment above a bakery, the kind of place with creaking floors and a single window that let in soft morning light. It was nothing like the sprawling pack house she had grown up in, but it was hers, and that mattered more than she expected it to. The pain of the rejected bond did not disappear when she crossed the territory line, though she had hoped it might. Instead, it settled into something quieter, a persistent ache that flared unexpectedly at random moments, usually late at night when she was too tired to keep her guard up. She learned to recognize the signs of an oncoming wave of pain, the tightness in her chest, the sudden chill that spread through her limbs, and she developed small rituals to help her through it. Hot tea, a worn blanket wrapped around her shoulders, music playing softly in the background to fill the silence. Grace called every few days, keeping her updated on news from home, though Elena asked her to avoid mentioning anything related to Marcus or the upcoming royal wedding. Grace respected the request, mostly, though occasionally a slip would happen, a stray comment about wedding preparations, or diplomatic meetings between Blackwood and House Nightshade, and Elena would feel the old wound reopen just slightly before she forced herself to move past it. She found work at a small design firm within her first month in the city, using skills she had developed during years of helping coordinate events and materials for the pack. Her new co-workers knew nothing about wolves or moon ceremonies or fated bonds. To them, she was simply Elena, a talented and quiet new hire who kept mostly to herself but produced excellent work. The anonymity felt like a balm on an open wound. No one here looked at her with pity. No one here whispered about the humiliation she had suffered in front of hundreds of witnesses. She was simply a person, building a simple life, and for the first time since the ceremony, she began to feel like she might actually survive this. But even as she built her new routine, even as the days began to blur together into something resembling normalcy, she could not entirely escape the memory of that night. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would replay the ceremony in her mind, searching for some detail she might have missed, some sign that Marcus had felt even a fraction of what she had felt in that brief moment before he rejected the bond entirely. She never found an answer that satisfied her. All she had was the memory of his eyes, meeting hers for a single fractured second, filled with something that might have been regret, before he turned away and chose a princess instead. Weeks passed, then a month, then two. Elena settled into her new life with a determination that surprised even her. She decorated her small apartment with plants and warm lighting, made friends with her downstairs neighbor who ran the bakery, and slowly began to rebuild a sense of self that did not revolve around what had happened at the moon ceremony. She still felt the occasional ache of the broken bond, but it no longer controlled her days the way it had in those first difficult weeks. She told herself, over and over, that she would never think about Marcus Cole again. She told herself that his choice had freed her, in a strange way, from a fate she had never asked for. She told herself that whatever happened between him and Princess Serafina was no longer any concern of hers. She almost believed it. What she could not have known, as she settled into her new apartment above the bakery and began building a life entirely her own, was that hundreds of miles away, in the grand halls of Blackwood territory, Marcus Cole was standing before his own reflection, on the morning of his wedding, staring into eyes that looked hollow and exhausted, wondering for the first time since the ceremony whether he had made a mistake that could never be undone. The wedding of Marcus Cole and Princess Serafina took place on a bright afternoon beneath a canopy of white flowers, in a courtyard filled with dignitaries from every allied territory. Marcus stood at the altar in a formal gray suit, his expression composed, his posture perfect, every inch the picture of a future alpha, securing his pack's future through a strategic union. Serafina walked toward him, wrapped in ivory silk, her dark hair pinned with silver ornaments that marked her royal lineage. She was beautiful, in the way that photographs are beautiful, flawless and distant, and when she reached the altar and took his hands in hers, Marcus felt nothing. No warmth, no spark, only the cold weight of duty settling over his shoulders like a heavy coat. He told himself this was normal. Political marriages were built on respect and shared goals, not on the reckless pull of fate. He told himself that the strange hollowness in his chest, the one that had appeared the moment he rejected the bond weeks earlier, would fade with time. He told himself a great many things that afternoon, and he believed almost none of them. The ceremony concluded without incident. Vows were exchanged. Rings were placed on trembling fingers. The gathered crowd applauded, and somewhere in the distance, fireworks lit up the sky, in celebration of the new alliance between Blackwood and House Nightshade. Marcus smiled for the photographs, shook hands with visiting dignitaries, and played the role expected of him with practiced ease. But that night, alone in his new chambers while Serafina attended to matters with her own advisors in a separate wing of the estate, Marcus sat by the window and stared out at the moon, feeling an emptiness so profound it frightened him. He thought about Elena. He had tried not to, in the weeks since the ceremony, filling his days with wedding preparations and diplomatic meetings so thoroughly that there was little room left for reflection. But now, in the quiet of his wedding night, with his new wife occupied elsewhere, the memory of Elena's face in the moment of rejection returned to him with startling clarity. He remembered the way she had grabbed the stone altar to keep from falling. He remembered the flash of pain that crossed her features before she forced herself to stand tall. He remembered, most of all, the moment their eyes had met just before she turned to leave, and the way something inside him had screamed at him to stop her, to take back the words he had just spoken, even as his mouth remained closed and his feet remained rooted to the ground. He had chosen duty. He had chosen the alliance his father had spent years negotiating. He had chosen the path that would secure Blackwood's future for generations to come. Surely that counted for something. Surely sacrifice for the good of the pack was worth more than a bond he had not asked for and had not expected. And yet, Marcus pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the same hollow ache that had settled there since the night of the ceremony. He had assumed the discomfort was simply the natural consequence of rejecting a mate bond, a temporary pain that would ease with time, much like Elena's own pain was supposed to fade. But as the weeks passed, the ache had not lessened. If anything, it had grown sharper, more insistent, a constant reminder of something missing that he could not quite name. He did not sleep well that night, or the nights that followed. His new marriage settled into a routine of polite distance, formal dinners, and carefully worded conversations about territory management and shared resources. Serafina was intelligent and articulate, skilled in the kind of political maneuvering that had made her family powerful for generations. But there was a coldness to her that Marcus found increasingly difficult to ignore, a calculating quality behind her every word and gesture that made him wonder, more than once, whether she viewed their marriage as anything more than a stepping stone toward greater influence. Weeks turned into months. Marcus threw himself into his duties as future alpha, working alongside his father to manage the pack's growing territory and increasingly complicated relationship with House Nightshade. He told himself that the ache in his chest was simply stress, exhaustion, the natural weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. But his instincts began to falter in ways he could not ignore. During pack training exercises, his usually sharp senses felt dulled, as if he were experiencing the world through a thick fog. His temper, once carefully controlled, grew unpredictable, flaring at small provocations that would never have bothered him before. Members of his own pack began to notice, exchanging worried glances whenever he snapped at a subordinate or lost focus during important meetings. His father called him into his study one evening, concern etched deeply into his weathered features. "Something is wrong with you, Marcus. I have watched you grow distant and short-tempered for months now. This is not the man I raised to lead this pack." Marcus wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that everything was fine, that he was simply adjusting to the pressures of his new responsibilities. But the words would not come. Instead, he found himself admitting, quietly, that he had not felt like himself since the night of the moon ceremony. His father's expression shifted from concern to something more solemn. "You rejected your fated mate, Marcus. Did you truly believe there would be no consequences?" "I did what was necessary for the pack," Marcus said, though the conviction in his voice had weakened considerably since the wedding day. "The alliance with House Nightshade secures our territory for the next generation." "Perhaps," his father said, "but a broken bond does not simply disappear because duty demanded it. The connection between fated mates runs deeper than politics, deeper than alliances. I have seen wolves who rejected their bonds before, Marcus. Few of them ever fully recovered." The words settled over Marcus like a physical weight. He left his father's study that night with more questions than answers, and for the first time since the ceremony, he allowed himself to seriously consider the possibility that he had made an irreversible mistake. He began seeking out pack elders, quietly, without drawing attention to his inquiries. He asked about the nature of fated bonds, about what happened when they were rejected, about whether there was any way to reverse the damage once it had been done. The answers he received varied, some elders offering vague reassurances that time would heal all wounds, others offering grim warnings about wolves, who had slowly withered away after severing a bond the moon itself had chosen. One elder, an old woman named Beatrice who had served the pack for over 60 years, gave him the answer that troubled him most. The bond does not truly disappear, young Alpha. It only grows dormant, waiting. If the two mates are ever reunited, if there is a genuine attempt at reconciliation, the connection can be restored. But it requires more than wishing for forgiveness. It requires proving, through action and sacrifice, that the rejection was a mistake worth undoing. Marcus turned these words over in his mind for weeks afterward. He thought about Elena, wondering where she had gone after leaving Blackwood territory, wondering if she carried the same hollow ache he did, wondering if there was any part of her that still thought about him at all. His marriage to Serafina continued its cold trajectory, each month bringing new evidence of the calculated nature behind her affections. She rarely sought his company outside of official functions, preferring instead to spend her time with visiting dignitaries and advisors from her own territory, building networks of influence that seemed to have little to do with strengthening the bond between their two houses. Marcus began to suspect that the marriage had never been about partnership at all, at least not from Serafina's perspective. It had been, from the very beginning, a calculated move towards something larger, something he had not yet fully understood. But even as these suspicions grew, even as the hollow ache in his chest deepened with each passing week, Marcus found himself thinking less about the political consequences of his marriage and more about the woman he had publicly humiliated on the night of the moon ceremony. He began to wonder, with growing certainty, whether the emptiness inside him would ever truly fade, or whether he had traded away something irreplaceable for a future that was already beginning to crumble beneath the weight of its own false promises. A year into the marriage, Marcus found himself standing outside Serafina's private study, listening to a conversation he was never meant to hear. Her voice, usually so measured and controlled, carried an edge of excitement through the heavy wooden door as she spoke with one of her advisors, a sharp-featured man named Adrian who had traveled with her from Nightshade territory. "The northern border negotiations are progressing exactly as planned," Serafina said. "Once we secure access to Blackwood's mineral reserves, my family will control resources from 3 separate territories. Marcus has no idea how thoroughly this marriage benefits us." Marcus stood frozen in the corridor, his hand hovering just above the door handle, his blood running cold at the casual way she discussed his pack's resources, as though they were nothing more than pieces on a game board. "And if he discovers the true extent of the arrangement?" Adrian asked. Serafina laughed, a sound Marcus had rarely heard, directed at anything genuine. "He won't. He is far too preoccupied with pack duties, and his own guilt over that rejected mate of his. I have seen the way he stares out windows at night, thinking no one notices. He is still grieving a bond he chose to break. He has no attention left for questioning my family's intentions." The words struck Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. He backed away from the door slowly, his mind racing through months of interactions with his wife, reconsidering every conversation, every carefully worded agreement, every moment he had assumed they were working together toward shared goals. All of it had been calculated. All of it had been part of a larger plan he had been too distracted, too broken, to notice. He did not confront her that night. Instead, he retreated to his private chambers and spent hours pacing the length of the room, his thoughts a chaotic storm of anger and betrayal, and, underneath it all, a strange and unwelcome clarity. Serafina had never cared about building a genuine partnership with him. She had seen an opportunity, a grieving alpha too consumed by guilt to notice the slow erosion of his pack's independence, and she had taken advantage of it with ruthless efficiency. Over the following weeks, Marcus began paying closer attention to the details he had previously overlooked. He reviewed trade agreements that had been quietly modified in Nightshade's favor. He noticed the increasing presence of Serafina's advisors within Blackwood's administrative circles, individuals who had somehow gained access to sensitive pack records under the guise of strengthening diplomatic cooperation. He recognized, with growing horror, that his marriage had become a vehicle for the systematic weakening of everything his family had built over generations. His father noticed the change in him almost immediately, the sharpened focus replacing months of distracted grief. When Marcus finally brought his suspicions to the elder Alpha, laying out the evidence he had gathered, his father's expression darkened with a fury Marcus had rarely witnessed. "We must address this carefully," his father said, pacing the length of his study. "House Nightshade has powerful allies. If we accuse the princess without irrefutable proof, we risk starting a conflict that could devastate both territories. Then we gather proof," Marcus said, his voice steady, with a resolve that had been missing for far too long. "I will not allow this pact to be dismantled from within, simply because I made a mistake I am still paying for." The words carried a weight he had not fully intended, an admission that had been building inside him for months. His father studied him carefully, something like understanding passing across his weathered features. "You are speaking of more than the alliance now." Marcus did not deny it. "I think about her constantly. I did not understand what I was giving up when I rejected the bond. I thought I understood duty, sacrifice, the needs of the pack above personal desire. But I traded something real for something hollow, and I have spent the last year paying the price for that mistake, in ways I never anticipated." His father was quiet for a long moment. "The bond can be mended, Marcus. Beatrice has told you as much already, but mending it will require more than regret. It will require you to prove, through sustained action, that you understand the depth of what you broke. I do not even know where she is." "Then find out, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention that might endanger her, or complicate the delicate situation we now find ourselves in, with House Nightshade." Marcus spent the following weeks operating on two fronts simultaneously. During the day, he worked with his father and a small circle of trusted advisors to quietly investigate the full extent of Serafina's manipulations, gathering evidence that would eventually need to be presented to the broader Pack Council. At night, he reached out to old contacts, tracking down anyone who might know where Elena had settled after leaving Blackwood territory. Grace Hollis proved to be his most significant obstacle. She had remained fiercely loyal to Elena throughout the past year, refusing to divulge any information about her friend's whereabouts, despite Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to reach out. When he finally approached her directly, catching her alone outside the Pack's administrative building, she made her feelings unmistakably clear. "You had your chance," Grace said, her voice sharp with barely restrained anger. "You stood in front of the entire Pack and told her she wasn't worth the cost of walking away from a political marriage. Now you want to find her because your own marriage isn't working out the way you hoped? That is not how this works, Marcus." "It is not about convenience," Marcus said, though he understood how the words might sound to someone who had watched Elena suffer through the worst humiliation of her life. "I made a mistake. A profound, devastating mistake, and I am trying to correct it before it destroys everything I care about, including her well-being, even if she never forgives me." Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Even if I believed you, and I am not certain I do, I would not tell you where she is. She has spent the last year building a life free from Blackwood politics and Pack drama. She does not need you showing up to disrupt that." Marcus left the conversation without the information he sought, but something in Grace's words lingered with him. Elena had built a new life. She had found some measure of peace, however fragile, in a place far from the pain he had caused her. Perhaps his father was right. Perhaps finding her would require more patience than desperation, more genuine transformation than hurried apology. In the meantime, the situation with House Nightshade continued to deteriorate. The evidence Marcus and his father gathered painted an increasingly damning picture of Serafina's true intentions, revealing a pattern of manipulation that extended back to before the marriage had even been formally arranged. Trade agreements had been deliberately structured to benefit Nightshade at Blackwood's expense. Sensitive information about Pack defenses had been quietly funneled back to her family. The alliance that had once seemed like a strategic necessity now looked increasingly like a calculated act of infiltration. Marcus confronted Serafina in her private study on a cold evening in late autumn, laying out the evidence he had gathered with a calm precision that surprised even himself. She did not deny the accusations, not entirely, though she attempted to frame her actions as simply protecting her family's interests within the bounds of a legitimate political marriage. "You knew what this arrangement was from the beginning," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth she had occasionally displayed during public functions. "Political marriages exist to benefit both parties. I have simply been better at leveraging the benefits than you have." By stealing resources? By placing spies within my PAC's administrative structure? By ensuring my family's continued relevance in a world that constantly threatens to leave weaker territories behind? Serafina's eyes narrowed. You were too distracted by your own grief to notice what was happening beneath your nose, Marcus. That is not my failure. That is yours. The words stung, but they also confirmed everything Marcus had begun to suspect over the past several months. His marriage had never been a partnership. It had been an opportunity Serafina exploited with ruthless efficiency, and he had been too consumed by the aftermath of rejecting his fated bond to recognize the danger until it had nearly cost his PAC everything. That night, standing alone in his study long after the confrontation had ended, Marcus made a decision that would define the following months of his life. He would end the marriage, formally and completely, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. He would work to repair the damage done to his PAC's territory and reputation. And he would find Elena, not to demand her forgiveness, but to finally understand the depth of the mistake he had made on that cold night beneath the full moon, and to begin the long, uncertain process of trying to earn back something he had thrown away without ever truly understanding its worth. News of the impending separation between Marcus and Serafina spread through Blackwood territory within days, though the full details of her betrayal remained carefully guarded within a small circle of trusted advisors. Publicly, the PAC was told only that the political marriage had failed to achieve its intended purpose, and that the alliance with House Nightshade was being dissolved through mutual agreement. Privately, the situation was far more volatile. Serafina's family, upon learning that their carefully constructed scheme had been discovered, responded with outrage and thinly veiled threats. Letters arrived at Blackwood territory demanding compensation for what they described as a broken marriage contract, while simultaneously denying any wrongdoing on Serafina's part. Marcus and his father spent weeks navigating the delicate diplomatic fallout, working to ensure that the dissolution of the marriage did not spark open conflict between the two territories. Serafina herself departed Blackwood territory quietly, without ceremony, taking with her only the possessions she had brought at the time of the wedding. Marcus watched from a distance as her carriage disappeared down the long road leading away from the pack house, feeling not sadness at her departure, but a profound sense of relief, mixed with lingering anger at how thoroughly he had allowed himself to be deceived. His father called a private meeting with the pack council to address the situation directly, laying out the evidence of Serafina's manipulations and outlining the steps being taken to repair the damage done to Blackwood's resources and reputation. The council members listened with grim expressions, several of them voicing concerns about how the pack had allowed itself to be so thoroughly compromised. We were focused on strength through alliance, one elder said. We failed to consider that alliance built on a broken foundation cannot hold weight, regardless of how carefully it is constructed. Marcus understood the implication clearly enough. The broken foundation was his rejected bond with Elena, the hollow grief that had consumed his attention and judgment during the exact period when he should have been most vigilant about protecting his PAC's interests. He did not argue against the assessment. He had reached the same conclusion himself, though the acknowledgement did little to ease the weight of guilt he now carried. In the months following Serafina's departure, Marcus threw himself into the work of restoring Blackwood's territory and reputation. He renegotiated the compromised trade agreements, strengthened internal security measures to prevent future infiltration, and worked closely with his father to rebuild trust with allied PACs who had watched the Nightshade Alliance collapse with a mixture of concern and cautious sympathy. But even as he focused on these responsibilities, thoughts of Elena remained a constant undercurrent beneath everything he did. The hollow ache in his chest had not lessened during the marriage, and if anything, it had grown sharper in the months since Serafina's departure, as though his body understood something his mind had only recently begun to accept. He had made a devastating mistake on the night of the moon ceremony, and no amount of political maneuvering or territorial restoration would ease the consequences of that choice. He returned to Beatrice, the elder who had first explained the nature of dormant bonds, seeking further guidance on what genuine reconciliation might require. You cannot simply appear before her and expect forgiveness, Beatrice told him, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap as she spoke. The bond does not repair itself through wishful thinking or grand gestures alone. It requires sustained proof of change, patience beyond what most wolves are willing to offer, and a willingness to accept that she may never choose to renew the connection, regardless of how thoroughly you demonstrate your transformation. Beatrice studied him carefully, because the alternative is living the remainder of your life with this hollow ache as your only companion, wondering endlessly what might have been possible had you found the courage to try. Some wolves choose that path, Marcus. They convince themselves that the pain will fade eventually, that time alone will heal what their own choices broke. In my experience, it rarely does. Her words settled into him with quiet finality. Marcus spent the following weeks preparing himself, not for a single dramatic confrontation, but for a sustained effort that might require years of patience and genuine transformation before Elena would ever consider trusting him again, if she considered it at all. He began by seeking information more carefully this time, working through legitimate channels rather than pressuring Grace for details she was unwilling to share. He learned, eventually, that Elena had settled in a city several hours from Blackwood territory, working at a design firm and building a quiet life free from pack politics. The information came not from Grace, who remained protectively silent, but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned Elena's new circumstances without realizing the significance of the details she was sharing. Marcus resisted the urge to travel immediately to the city, understanding on some level that arriving unannounced and desperate would likely do more harm than good. Instead, he spent additional months focused on rebuilding Blackwood's stability, proving to himself and to his pack that he could be trusted with the responsibilities of leadership, despite the catastrophic misjudgment of his first marriage. During this period, he also began the difficult work of examining his own choices more honestly than he had allowed himself to during the initial months following the ceremony. He had told himself, at the time, that rejecting the bond was an act of sacrifice for the greater good of his pack. But as he looked back with clearer eyes, he recognized a more uncomfortable truth. He had been afraid of the vulnerability that came with a fated bond, afraid of losing control over his own future to a connection he had not chosen for himself, afraid of disappointing his father by deviating from a carefully planned political alliance. Fear, not duty, had driven his decision that night. And fear had cost him something he was only now beginning to understand the true value of. He wrote letters he never sent, dozens of them, each attempt to articulate his regret feeling inadequate against the magnitude of what he had done. He spoke with pack elders about the nature of forgiveness and redemption, seeking guidance that felt increasingly personal rather than academic. He watched his father navigate the aftermath of the failed alliance with a patience and resilience that Marcus found himself trying to emulate, understanding that rebuilding trust, whether with an entire pack or with a single woman he had deeply wronged, would require far more than good intentions. Nearly a year after Serafina's departure, Marcus finally felt ready to take the first tentative step toward finding Elena. Not to demand anything from her, not to insist on immediate forgiveness or reconciliation, but simply to see her, to acknowledge in person the depth of the mistake he had made, and to begin whatever long and uncertain process might eventually lead toward healing the bond he had so carelessly broken. He did not know, as he made preparations for the journey, whether she would even agree to see him. He did not know whether 2 years of separation had hardened her heart beyond any hope of reconciliation, or whether some small part of her might still carry the same dormant connection that continued to ache within his own chest every single day. All he knew was that he could no longer live with the uncertainty of never trying, regardless of how the attempt might end. Elena's second year in the city passed more gently than the first. The sharp, unpredictable waves of pain from the broken bond had softened into something she had learned to manage, a quiet ache that surfaced occasionally, but no longer controlled the rhythm of her days. She had earned a promotion at the design firm, moved into a slightly larger apartment with an actual view of the park across the street, and built a small circle of friends who knew nothing about pack politics or fated mates, or the humiliation she had endured beneath a full moon 2 years earlier. Among these new friends was Daniel Whitmore, a soft-spoken architect who worked in the office 2 floors above her design firm. They had met in the building's shared coffee shop, bonding initially over a mutual appreciation for a particularly excellent pastry the bakery downstairs produced each morning, and their friendship had grown slowly and comfortably over the following months. Daniel was steady in a way Elena found deeply reassuring, patient and kind, without any of the intensity or unpredictability she associated with pack life. He made her laugh. He remembered small details about her preferences and asked thoughtful questions about her work. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give. She had not told him about her wolf nature. Not yet. Uncertain how to explain something so fundamental to her identity, without revealing the painful history attached to it. But she found herself thinking, more and more often, that Daniel represented a possible future entirely separate from the one that had been stolen from her at the moon ceremony. A future built on choice rather than fate, on steady affection rather than the overwhelming intensity of a bond she had never asked for in the first place. Grace visited occasionally, taking the long train ride from Blackwood territory, to spend weekends catching up on the details of Elena's new life. During one such visit, nearly 2 years after the ceremony, Grace mentioned, carefully and with obvious hesitation, that Marcus's marriage to Princess Serafina had ended. Elena felt a strange mixture of emotions upon hearing the news, surprise mingling with something she refused to examine too closely. What happened? Betrayal, apparently. Serafina was using the marriage to funnel resources back to her own family. Marcus and his father discovered the extent of it and ended the alliance. Grace watched Elena's expression carefully as she spoke. There's more. He has been trying to find you. The words landed with unexpected weight. Why would he want to find me? I don't know exactly what he wants, and I have not told him anything about where you are. But Elena, he seemed different when he approached me, less certain of himself, more like a man carrying genuine regret than someone simply seeking a convenient solution to a failed marriage. Elena felt the old wound stir uncomfortably at the mention of him, a reminder that the bond, though quiet, had never fully disappeared. It doesn't matter what he wants. He made his choice 2 years ago, in front of everyone. I have built a life here that has nothing to do with him, and I intend to keep it that way. Grace did not push the subject further that weekend, though Elena noticed her friend watching her with a thoughtful expression whenever the conversation drifted anywhere near the topic of Blackwood territory or pack politics. Elena tried, in the weeks following Grace's visit, to push the news from her mind entirely. She focused on her work, spent more time with Daniel, and told herself that whatever had happened between Marcus and Serafina was no longer any concern of hers. But the news had disturbed the careful equilibrium she had built over the past 2 years, stirring memories she had worked hard to keep buried. She began having dreams she had not experienced since the earliest weeks after the rejection, vivid and unsettling images of the ceremony grounds, of Marcus's face in the moment before he spoke the words that shattered the bond between them. She woke from these dreams with her heart racing, the phantom ache in her chest more pronounced than it had been in months, and she found herself wondering, despite every effort not to, what exactly Marcus had discovered about the true nature of his failed marriage, and what had driven him to start searching for her after 2 years of silence. Daniel noticed the change in her, the distracted quality that had crept into her demeanor in the weeks following Grace's visit. He asked, gently, if something was troubling her, and Elena found herself sharing a carefully edited version of her past, describing a difficult relationship that had ended badly, without revealing the full supernatural context behind it. He hurt you, Daniel said simply, after she finished speaking, and now he wants to make amends. I don't know what he wants, Elena admitted. And honestly, it doesn't matter. Whatever happened between us is finished. I built this life without him, and I intend to keep building it that way. Daniel studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and slightly guarded in his expression. You say that with a lot of conviction, for someone who seems this shaken by the news. The observation struck closer to the truth than Elena wanted to admit, even to herself. She changed the subject, steering their conversation toward lighter topics, but Daniel's words lingered with her long after their evening together ended. Over the following weeks, Elena threw herself more deeply into her work, taking on additional projects at the design firm and volunteering for assignments that kept her occupied late into the evenings. The distraction helped, mostly, though the dreams continued intermittently, and the quiet ache in her chest never fully settled back into the manageable rhythm she had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. She began to wonder, despite her best efforts not to, what Marcus looked like now, whether the marriage and its collapse had changed him, in ways beyond what Grace had described. She wondered whether he still carried the same composed confidence he had displayed on the night of the ceremony, or whether 2 years of consequence had worn away at that careful mask, revealing something more vulnerable underneath. She told herself these thoughts meant nothing, that curiosity about a painful chapter of her past was natural, regardless of how thoroughly she had moved forward from it. But late at night, when the apartment above the bakery grew quiet, and the city lights outside her window cast long shadows across the ceiling, Elena could not entirely convince herself that the question of Marcus Cole had been fully settled, regardless of how firmly she insisted otherwise during her daylight conversations with Grace and Daniel. She did not yet know that within a matter of weeks, the question would no longer remain hypothetical. Marcus had already begun the journey toward the city, carrying with him nearly a year of preparation, genuine transformation, and a determination to finally face the woman he had wronged so publicly, beneath the light of a full moon 2 years earlier. The city felt overwhelming to Marcus in ways he had not anticipated, filled with unfamiliar sounds and scents that his wolf senses struggled to properly process amid the constant noise of traffic and crowds. He stood outside the small design firm where, according to information he had finally gathered through careful and legitimate channels, Elena had worked for the past 2 years, and he felt his resolve waver for the first time since beginning the long journey from Blackwood territory. He had rehearsed what he might say countless times during the hours of travel, but standing now on the sidewalk outside her workplace, every carefully prepared sentence felt inadequate against the weight of what he actually needed to convey. He was not here simply to apologize. He was here to acknowledge, fully and without excuse, the depth of the mistake he had made, and to begin whatever process might eventually allow him to earn back even a fraction of her trust. He did not approach her that first day. Instead, he found a small hotel near the design firm and spent the evening gathering his thoughts, watching the sunset paint the unfamiliar skyline in shades of orange and purple, feeling the persistent ache in his chest intensify with proximity to the woman who had carried half of the broken bond for the past 2 years. The following morning, he positioned himself across the street from the design firm, waiting until he saw her emerge for her lunch break. The sight of her nearly stole the breath from his lungs. She looked different than he remembered, her hair slightly longer, her posture carrying a confidence that had not been present during their brief encounters years earlier. She moved through the city streets with the easy familiarity of someone who had built a genuine home for herself, someone who belonged here, in a way she had perhaps never fully belonged within the rigid structure of pack life. He watched her disappear into a small cafe down the street, and after several minutes of internal debate, he crossed the road and followed her inside. Elena was seated at a small table near the window, reviewing what appeared to be design sketches spread across the surface in front of her, when she looked up and saw him standing just inside the entrance. The recognition that crossed her face was immediate and unmistakable. Shock, rapidly giving way to something harder, more guarded. Marcus. His name left her lips like an accusation. Elena. He approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome, stopping a respectful distance from her table. I know this must be a shock. I should have found a better way to approach you than simply appearing at your workplace. How did you even find me? Her voice carried a tremor. She seemed to be fighting to control, anger, and something else, something more vulnerable, mixing together beneath the surface. It took time, he admitted. I did not want to pressure Grace for information she was clearly reluctant to share. I gathered what I could through other channels, carefully, without wanting to disrupt whatever life you had built here. And yet here you are, disrupting exactly that. The bitterness in her words landed like a physical blow, though Marcus understood he had no right to feel wounded by it. He had earned every ounce of her anger, and far more besides. I understand if you do not wish to speak with me, he said. I only ask for a few minutes of your time. I have things I need to say, regardless of whether you choose to forgive me for any of them. Elena studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through several emotions Marcus could not fully read. Finally, she gestured toward the empty chair across from her, though her posture remained stiff and guarded as he sat down. You have 5 minutes, she said, and then I need you to leave and never contact me again. Marcus nodded, understanding the terms even as something in his chest tightened at the finality of her words. I made a devastating mistake 2 years ago. I told myself, at the time, that I was making a sacrifice for the good of my pack, choosing duty over a bond I had not asked for and did not understand. But that was not the truth. The truth is that I was afraid of vulnerability, afraid of losing control over my future, afraid of disappointing my father by deviating from a plan he had spent years arranging. I let that fear drive a decision that hurt you in ways I did not fully comprehend until much later. Elena's jaw tightened, but she did not interrupt him. My marriage to Serafina was a catastrophe, not simply because it was loveless, but because I allowed my grief and distraction over rejecting you to blind me to what was actually happening within my own household. She used my brokenness against my pack, manipulating resources and information while I was too consumed by regret to notice. It cost my territory dearly, and it forced me to confront, finally, the true extent of what I had thrown away that night. So this is about your guilt, Elena said sharply. About easing your own conscience now that your convenient marriage has fallen apart. No. Marcus met her eyes directly, holding her gaze, despite the obvious anger radiating from her. This is about you, Elena. About the pain I caused you in front of hundreds of witnesses, pain you should never have been forced to endure. I am not here asking for forgiveness. I do not believe I deserve it, not after everything I put you through. I am here because I finally understood, far too late, exactly what I destroyed that night, and I could not continue living without at least attempting to acknowledge that to you directly. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her design sketches, her eyes fixed somewhere over his shoulder rather than meeting his gaze directly. 2 years, Marcus. 2 years. I spent rebuilding myself, after you humiliated me in front of everyone I had ever known. 2 years of learning to live with pain you inflicted, without a moment of hesitation. And now you show up, unannounced, expecting what exactly? Absolution? A second chance? I am not expecting anything, he said quietly. I am hoping, perhaps, for the smallest possibility, that someday, if I prove through sustained action, rather than empty words, that I have genuinely changed, you might be willing to consider whatever future remains possible between us. But I understand, if that hope is unreasonable. I understand if the damage I caused cannot be undone, regardless of how much time or effort I dedicate to trying. Elena stood abruptly, gathering her design sketches with hands that trembled slightly, despite her obvious effort to appear composed. Your 5 minutes are finished. I need you to leave now. Marcus rose as well, understanding the conversation had reached its natural end, at least for today. I will not pressure you further. I will not appear unannounced at your workplace again, but I am not giving up, Elena. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I did, but I intend to spend whatever time is necessary, proving that the man who rejected you 2 years ago is not the man standing before you now. You cannot simply decide to be a different person because your convenient marriage fell apart, Elena said, her voice tight with barely restrained emotion. People do not change that quickly, and even if they do, some wounds do not heal, simply because the person who caused them finally feels sorry about it. I know, Marcus said quietly. I am not asking you to heal on my timeline. I am asking only for the chance to try, however long that might take. Elena did not respond. She simply gathered the last of her belongings and walked past him, out of the cafe and into the busy city street, leaving Marcus standing alone amid the quiet murmur of other patrons who had clearly overheard at least fragments of their tense exchange. He did not follow her. He had promised not to pressure her further, and he intended to keep that promise, regardless of how desperately every instinct urged him to chase after her and continue pleading his case. Instead, he returned to his hotel room and sat by the window overlooking the unfamiliar city, feeling the hollow ache in his chest pulse with renewed intensity, now that he had finally seen her again, after 2 long years of separation. The conversation had not gone as he hoped, though he had not truly expected it to. Elena's anger was justified, her walls carefully constructed after 2 years of learning to live without him. Tearing down those walls would require far more than a single desperate conversation in a city cafe. It would require patience beyond anything he had previously demonstrated, and a willingness to accept that his efforts might ultimately fail, regardless of how genuine his transformation proved to be. But as he sat alone in the gathering darkness, watching unfamiliar city lights flicker to life outside his window, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would not give up, regardless of how long the process required, regardless of how many times Elena turned him away. He had spent 2 years learning the true cost of choosing fear over connection, duty over genuine partnership, and he was not prepared to let that lesson go unlearned simply because the path toward redemption proved difficult. Elena did not tell Daniel about the encounter with Marcus, not at first. She returned to her apartment that evening, shaken and unsettled. The careful equilibrium she had spent 2 years constructing, suddenly feeling precarious, in ways she had not anticipated. She sat by her window long after darkness fell, replaying the conversation over and over, examining every word Marcus had spoken for signs of manipulation or genuine remorse, uncertain which interpretation frightened her more. She had wanted, for 2 years, to believe that Marcus Cole no longer had any power over her emotional well-being. She had built a life specifically designed to exist independently of him, of pack politics, of the humiliation she had suffered beneath that full moon. Seeing him again, hearing him speak with what appeared to be genuine anguish about the mistake he had made, threatened to unravel the careful distance she had worked so hard to establish. She called Grace that night, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, as she described the encounter in the cafe. "He actually came to your city?" Grace's voice carried genuine surprise. "I told him I would not share your location, but I suspected he might find some other way eventually. How did you feel, seeing him again?" "Angry," Elena said immediately. Furious that he thought he could simply appear after 2 years and expect some kind of reconciliation because his marriage happened to fall apart. "Is that truly what you felt? Only anger?" Elena hesitated, recognizing the careful way Grace phrased the question. "It's complicated. He said things that sounded genuine. He talked about fear driving his decision that night, about finally understanding what he threw away. Part of me wanted to believe him, and that terrifies me more than anything else about this entire situation." "Why does it terrify you?" "Because believing him means opening myself back up to the possibility of being hurt again. I spent 2 years building walls specifically to prevent that kind of vulnerability, and one conversation in a cafe nearly tore all of it down." Grace was quiet for a moment before responding. "You do not have to decide anything right now, Elena. You can hold your anger and your uncertainty at the same time. You can refuse to forgive him while still acknowledging that people are sometimes capable of genuine change. Whatever you decide, take the time you need to decide it properly, without pressure from him or from anyone else, including me." The advice offered some small comfort, though it did little to settle the storm of conflicting emotions churning beneath Elena's careful composure. She did not sleep well that night, her dreams returning once again to fragmented images of the ceremony grounds, though this time mixed with newer memories of Marcus's face across the cafe table, his eyes carrying an intensity of regret she had not expected to encounter. Over the following days, Elena threw herself back into her work routine, hoping the familiar rhythm of design projects and client meetings might help restore the equilibrium the unexpected encounter had disrupted. Daniel noticed her continued distraction, though he did not push for explanations she was not ready to provide. His patience, steady and undemanding, offered a quiet contrast to the chaotic emotions Marcus's appearance had stirred within her. True to his word, Marcus did not appear at her workplace again in the days that followed. But 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at her apartment, forwarded through a series of contacts that Elena could not entirely trace, though she suspected Grace had reluctantly provided her address after being convinced, somehow, that Marcus's intentions were sincere enough to warrant the risk. The letter was handwritten, the penmanship careful and deliberate, as though he had drafted multiple versions before settling on the final wording. Elena read it standing in her kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she absorbed the contents. He wrote about the specific steps he had taken since ending his marriage to repair the damage done to his pack's territory and reputation. He wrote about conversations with pack elders regarding the nature of broken bonds and genuine reconciliation. He wrote, most surprisingly, about the fear that had driven his original decision, examining it with a level of self-awareness she had not expected from the composed, confident alpha she remembered from the ceremony grounds. He did not ask for anything in the letter. He did not request a response, did not push for another meeting, did not demand forgiveness or even acknowledgement. He simply laid out, in careful and deliberate prose, the full extent of his continuing efforts to understand and correct the mistake he had made, closing the letter with a simple statement that he would continue writing periodically, without expectation of reply, for as long as it took to demonstrate that his transformation was genuine rather than convenient. Elena did not respond to the letter, though she found herself reading it multiple times over the following weeks, searching for inconsistencies or manipulation that she could point to as justification for dismissing his words entirely. She found none. The letter read as genuinely as it had sounded in person, careful and thoughtful, devoid of the desperate pleading she might have expected from a man simply seeking to ease his own guilty conscience. A second letter arrived a month later, detailing continued efforts within his pack to strengthen defenses against the kind of manipulation that had nearly cost them everything during his marriage to Serafina. A third letter followed several weeks after that, describing conversations with his father about the nature of leadership and the mistakes even well-intentioned alphas could make when driven by fear rather than genuine understanding. Elena kept every letter, though she told herself repeatedly that keeping them meant nothing beyond simple curiosity about how the situation with House Nightshade had ultimately resolved. She did not share the letters with Daniel, uncertain how to explain their significance without revealing details about her wolf nature that she still had not found the courage to disclose. Her relationship with Daniel continued during this period, though Elena found herself increasingly aware of a growing distance between them, a hesitation on her part that she suspected he could sense, even if he did not fully understand its source. He remained patient, kind, undemanding, offering steady companionship that asked nothing of her beyond simple honesty about where she stood emotionally. "You seem distracted lately," he said one evening, as they walked together through the park near her apartment. "More than usual, I mean. Is everything all right?" Elena considered deflecting the question, as she had done so many times before, but something in his gentle, patient expression made her want to offer more honesty than she had previously allowed herself. "There's someone from my past who has been trying to reach out, someone who hurt me very badly, a long time ago. I thought I had moved past it entirely, but apparently there are still parts of that history I have not fully resolved. Do you want to resolve them?" The question struck her with unexpected force. Did she want to resolve them? Did she want to finally confront the lingering pain of that rejection? To examine whether Marcus's continued efforts represented genuine transformation or simply persistent manipulation? Or did she prefer to remain safely within the careful distance she had constructed, protecting herself from the possibility of further hurt, regardless of how it might limit her capacity for future connection? "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Part of me wants to close that chapter permanently, to prove to myself that I have moved beyond needing any resolution at all. But another part of me keeps wondering whether ignoring it entirely means I am simply running from something I eventually need to face." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than hurt by her admission. "Whatever you decide, Elena, I hope you make the choice that genuinely serves your own healing, rather than simply avoiding discomfort in either direction." His words lingered with her long after their evening together ended, settling alongside the growing collection of letters she had received from Marcus, each one adding another layer of complexity to a situation she had once believed was permanently and definitively closed. Back in Blackwood territory, the full consequences of Serafina's betrayal continued to unfold in ways that demanded the majority of Marcus's attention throughout the following year. What had initially appeared to be a contained instance of resource manipulation revealed itself, upon deeper investigation, to be a far more extensive network of infiltration that had been operating within Blackwood's administrative structure for the entirety of the marriage. Marcus worked alongside his father and a carefully selected team of trusted advisors to trace the full extent of the damage, uncovering compromised trade agreements, redirected resources, and sensitive territorial information that had been systematically funneled back to House Nightshade over the course of many months. The revelations painted an increasingly troubling picture of just how thoroughly the Pack's vulnerabilities had been exploited during the period when Marcus had been too consumed by grief and guilt to notice the warning signs surrounding him. The diplomatic fallout proved equally complicated. House Nightshade, rather than acknowledging Serafina's manipulations, continued to frame the dissolution of the marriage as an unjustified insult to their family's honor, demanding compensation and threatening to withdraw support from other allied territories who had previously maintained peaceful relations with Blackwood. Marcus found himself navigating an increasingly delicate web of negotiations, working to prevent the situation from escalating into open conflict while simultaneously refusing to accept blame for a betrayal that had never been his fault. Throughout this period, he continued writing to Elena, though her silence in response to each letter tested his resolve in ways he had not fully anticipated. He understood, intellectually, that her lack of response did not necessarily indicate rejection. Beatrice had warned him repeatedly that genuine reconciliation required patience beyond what most wolves were willing to offer, and he reminded himself of this counsel each time he sealed another envelope without any certainty that its contents would ever be acknowledged. His father watched this process unfold with a mixture of concern and cautious approval. "You have changed significantly this past year," he observed one evening, as they reviewed the latest developments in the ongoing negotiations with House Nightshade. The wolf who rejected his fated mate 2 years ago would never have demonstrated this kind of patience or self-reflection. "Perhaps," Marcus said, "though I fear the change has come too late to matter to the person it should matter most to." "Genuine change rarely arrives precisely when it would be most convenient," his father replied, "but that does not mean it arrives too late to matter at all. Continue your efforts, Marcus, with patience and without expectation. Whatever comes of them will come in its own time." The advice offered small comfort during the months that followed, months filled with continued diplomatic tensions, internal pack restructuring designed to prevent future vulnerabilities, and letters sent into what felt increasingly like an unresponsive void. Marcus began to wonder, during his more discouraged moments, whether Elena had simply discarded each letter without reading it, whether his continued efforts represented genuine hope, or simply stubborn denial of a reality he was unwilling to accept. Grace, during occasional visits to Blackwood territory, to see family members who remained within the pack, provided small fragments of reassurance, without revealing details that might compromise Elena's privacy. "She has not asked me to intervene or tell you to stop writing," Grace mentioned during one such visit, her tone carefully neutral. "I do not know what that means precisely, but it seems worth noting." Marcus clung to these small fragments of information, understanding they offered no guarantee of eventual reconciliation, but providing enough sustenance to continue his patient efforts, despite the persistent silence on Elena's end. The situation with House Nightshade eventually reached a resolution nearly 18 months after Marcus first discovered the extent of Serafina's manipulations. Facing mounting evidence and pressure from other allied territories who had grown increasingly wary of Nightshade's reputation for manipulative diplomacy, the family finally agreed to a formal settlement that acknowledged Serafina's wrongdoing, while avoiding the kind of open conflict that would have devastated both territories. Serafina herself was formally exiled from her family's inner circle, stripped of the diplomatic influence she had wielded so effectively during her brief marriage to Marcus. The resolution brought a measure of closure to a painful chapter of Blackwood's history, though Marcus found himself feeling less triumphant about the outcome than he might have expected. The entire situation, from beginning to end, remained inextricably tied to the mistake he had made 2 years earlier, a constant reminder of how thoroughly a single moment of fear-driven decision-making had reshaped the trajectory of his entire life. With the Nightshade situation finally resolved, Marcus found himself with renewed capacity to focus on the slow, patient work of demonstrating genuine transformation to the woman he continued to write to each month, regardless of her continued silence. He deepened his involvement in pack governance, working closely with elders to establish stronger protections against the kind of manipulation that had nearly destroyed his territory. He mentored younger pack members who were beginning to navigate their own complicated relationships with duty and personal desire, sharing lessons learned from his own painful mistakes without ever fully disclosing the specific details of his continuing efforts to reconcile with Elena. Nearly 2.5 years after the original rejection, during a particularly difficult evening, when the hollow ache in his chest felt more pronounced than it had in months, Marcus found himself questioning whether his continued letters represented genuine hope, or simply an inability to accept that some mistakes could never be fully corrected, regardless of how much time and effort were dedicated to trying. He sat down that night and wrote what he privately considered might be his final letter, an honest and complete accounting of everything he had learned during the years since the ceremony, closing with an acknowledgement that he would understand and respect whatever decision Elena ultimately made, even if that decision meant permanent silence and no possibility of eventual reconciliation. He sealed the letter and sent it the following morning, uncertain whether it represented the end of his efforts or simply another step in a journey that might continue for years to come, regardless of whether it ever reached the destination he hoped for. Elena read the final letter 3 times before setting it down on her kitchen table, her hands unsteady, in a way that surprised her. Something about the tone felt different from the dozens of letters that had preceded it, an exhausted honesty that lacked the careful hopefulness she had grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. He was not asking for anything this time. He was simply releasing her, acknowledging that his continued efforts might never lead anywhere, and that he would accept her silence, permanently, without further contact. She had not expected the letter to affect her so deeply. She had spent nearly 3 years now telling herself, and everyone around her, that Marcus Cole no longer held any power over her emotional life. She had built a career, a home, a circle of genuine friendships, entirely independent of pack politics, and the humiliation of that moon ceremony. And yet, reading his words of quiet resignation, she felt something inside her chest tighten with an emotion she was reluctant to name. She called Grace that evening, her voice carrying an unfamiliar uncertainty. He sent what sounds like a final letter. He is saying he will stop writing, that he understands if I never respond, that he will respect whatever decision I make, even if it means permanent silence. How do you feel about that? Grace asked carefully. I don't know, Elena admitted. I thought I would feel relieved. Instead, I feel something closer to panic, and I cannot entirely explain why. Grace was quiet for a moment before responding. Elena, I have watched you build an incredible life over these past 3 years. I am proud of everything you have accomplished, entirely on your own terms. But I have also watched you keep every single letter he has sent, reading them multiple times even when you insisted you were only checking for signs of manipulation. Perhaps it is time to be honest with yourself about what those actions actually mean. Elena did not respond immediately, turning Grace's words over in her mind long after their conversation ended. She thought about her relationship with Daniel, which had gradually settled into a comfortable but somewhat static pattern over the past year, neither progressing toward deeper commitment nor ending entirely, as though some part of her remained unable to fully commit while lingering questions about her past remained unresolved. She thought about the dormant ache that still occasionally surfaced within her chest, quieter now than it had been in the earliest months after the rejection, but never fully absent. She thought about Marcus's face across that cafe table, nearly 3 years earlier, the genuine anguish in his eyes as he acknowledged the depth of his mistake, and the careful, patient consistency of his letters in the years since, never once pressuring her for a response, never once suggesting she owed him anything beyond whatever she chose to freely give. Over the following weeks, Elena found herself returning to the collection of letters she had kept carefully organized in a small box at the back of her closet, reading through them chronologically for the first time, tracing the evolution of Marcus's language and self-understanding across nearly 3 years of consistent, patient correspondence. The early letters carried a raw, almost desperate quality, filled with detailed accounts of his efforts to repair the damage from Serafina's betrayal and his growing understanding of the fear that had driven his original rejection. The later letters read differently, calmer and more reflective, describing his ongoing work mentoring younger pack members, his evolving relationship with his father, his continued efforts to build a version of leadership that balanced duty with genuine emotional honesty, rather than the fear-driven decision-making that had defined his choices during the moon ceremony 3 years earlier. She noticed, reading through this progression, that the letters had gradually shifted from focusing primarily on his own guilt and efforts at redemption toward a broader reflection on the kind of person he wanted to become, regardless of whether that transformation ever led to reconciliation with her specifically. The shift felt significant to her in ways she had not initially recognized, suggesting a genuine internal change, rather than simply persistent manipulation, aimed at winning back something he had lost. Daniel noticed the shift in her demeanor during this period, the increased distraction and thoughtfulness that seemed to accompany her private reading sessions. He approached the subject directly one evening, his tone gentle, but carrying an honesty that Elena had come to deeply appreciate throughout their friendship. I think you need to resolve whatever remains unresolved with your past, he said. Not because I want you gone from my life, Elena, but because I care about you enough to recognize that you cannot fully move forward, in any direction, while carrying this much unexamined weight. I don't want to lose what we have built together, Elena said, surprised by the sudden emotion in her own voice. You won't lose my friendship, regardless of what you decide, Daniel said gently. But I think we both know that whatever exists between us has never quite crossed into something deeper, and perhaps that hesitation has less to do with me and more to do with questions you have not yet allowed yourself to fully answer. His words, offered without bitterness or resentment, settled something within Elena that she had been avoiding examining too closely. She had cared for Daniel deeply throughout their friendship, but she recognized, finally, that the reluctance to deepen their connection stemmed from an unresolved chapter of her life that continued to occupy far more emotional space than she had been willing to acknowledge. She spent the following week in careful, deliberate reflection, examining her own feelings with an honesty she had previously avoided. She thought about the woman she had been on the night of the moon ceremony, young and uncertain, her identity still largely defined by pack expectations and the desires of others. She thought about the woman she had become over the past 3 years, independent and capable, having built a genuine life entirely through her own effort and determination. She recognized, finally, that whatever decision she made regarding Marcus would not diminish the strength or independence she had cultivated during their years apart. She was no longer the same person who had collapsed against a stone altar 3 years earlier, overwhelmed by a bond she had not chosen and a rejection she had not anticipated. She had rebuilt herself entirely, and any future decision regarding Marcus would be made from a position of strength rather than desperation or need. This recognition brought a strange sense of clarity that had eluded her throughout the previous months of uncertainty. She was not obligated to forgive Marcus simply because he had demonstrated years of patient effort. She was not obligated to reject him simply to prove her own independence and resilience. She could approach whatever decision she ultimately made from a place of genuine choice, weighing the evidence of his transformation against her own carefully protected boundaries, without feeling pressured by either desperate hope or defensive anger. She began, cautiously, to consider what an actual conversation with Marcus might look like now. 3 years removed from the raw devastation of that initial cafe encounter. She thought about the questions she would need answered, the specific assurances she would require, before even considering the possibility of allowing the dormant bond between them to be examined more closely. She did not respond to his final letter immediately, needing additional time to fully organize her thoughts and feelings before taking any action that might reshape the careful equilibrium she had spent years constructing. But she also did not discard the letter, or dismiss the possibility it represented, keeping it instead alongside the others in her small collection, a tangible reminder of a chapter in her life that remained, despite everything, still unresolved. Nearly a month after receiving what Marcus had described as his final letter, Elena finally sat down at her kitchen table and began composing a response, her first in nearly 3 years of consistent silence, uncertain exactly what she wanted to say, but understanding, finally, that continued silence no longer served the genuine healing she had spent years working toward. The letter Marcus received nearly 3 years after the night of the moon ceremony was short, far shorter than any of the dozens he had sent over the preceding years. He recognized Elena's handwriting immediately from the envelope, and his hands trembled slightly as he opened it, uncertain what to expect after months of complete silence following what he had believed was his final attempt at reaching her. The letter contained only a handful of sentences. She was not offering forgiveness, not yet, and she was not promising any particular outcome, but she was willing, she wrote, to meet with him one final time, in person, to have an honest conversation about everything that had happened, and everything that might still be possible between them, without any guarantee about where that conversation might lead. Marcus read the letter more times than he could count, allowing himself, for the first time in years, a fragile and cautious hope that he had trained himself to suppress throughout the long months of silence. He wrote back immediately, agreeing to whatever time and location she preferred, promising to arrive without expectation, and to accept whatever outcome resulted from their conversation. They met, eventually, at a quiet park near Elena's apartment, chosen deliberately as neutral ground away from both the memories of Blackwood territory and the private spaces of her carefully constructed new life. Marcus arrived early, watching the afternoon light filter through the trees, feeling the persistent ache in his chest intensify with anticipation as the appointed time approached. Elena arrived precisely on schedule, walking toward him with a composed confidence that immediately struck him as different from the woman he remembered from their cafe encounter 3 years earlier. She had grown into herself even further during the intervening years, carrying herself with a quiet strength that suggested she no longer needed anything from him, regardless of how their conversation ultimately unfolded. They sat together on a bench overlooking a small pond, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of 3 years of separation settling comfortably into the space between them. "I read every letter you sent," Elena said finally. "Every single one. Multiple times. I want you to know that, regardless of what happens today." "I did not expect that," Marcus admitted. "I assumed, after so long without response, that you had simply stopped reading them. I almost did, more than once, but something always brought me back to them." She turned to look at him directly, her eyes carrying a clarity that had not been present during their earlier encounter. "I have spent 3 years building an entire life separate from you, Marcus. A life I am genuinely proud of, built on my own terms, without needing anything from pack politics or fated bonds to feel complete. I understand that. I have never wanted to diminish what you built here." "I know," Elena said, and something in her tone suggested she genuinely meant it. "That is part of why I finally agreed to this conversation. Your letters never asked me to abandon the life I built. They never demanded I return to Blackwood, or resume some role I never wanted in the first place. You simply kept showing up, patiently, honestly, without pressure, and eventually, I had to acknowledge that consistency means something, especially from someone who once acted so impulsively out of fear." Marcus felt something in his chest loosen slightly, though he remained cautious about interpreting her words as more hopeful than she intended. "What are you saying, Elena?" "I am saying that I do not know exactly what the future holds," she said carefully. "I am not promising you the reconciliation of our bond, not today, perhaps not ever, but I am willing to consider the possibility that people can genuinely change, that the fear-driven choices we make in a single moment do not have to define the entirety of who we become afterward. I have watched you, from a distance, spend 3 years proving that transformation, through consistent action, rather than empty words. I will not pressure you toward any particular outcome," Marcus said. "I only want the chance to continue demonstrating, through whatever time you are willing to offer, that the mistake I made 3 years ago no longer represents who I am today." Elena studied him for a long moment, the late afternoon light casting soft shadows across her features. "I have built a life here that I love, Marcus. Whatever happens between us, I will not abandon that life, or the person I have become while building it. If there is any possibility of a future between us, it will need to exist alongside everything I have created, not in place of it." "I would never ask you to sacrifice what you have built," Marcus said, meaning every word with a conviction that surprised even himself. "If you are willing to allow me even a small place within that life, I will spend however long necessary, proving that I understand the true value of what I nearly lost forever." They sat together for a long while after that, talking more openly than they had during any of their previous encounters, discussing the years they had spent apart, the ways they had each grown and changed, the uncertain shape of whatever future might still remain possible between them. Elena did not offer immediate forgiveness, and Marcus did not expect it, but something had shifted between them during that quiet afternoon conversation, a tentative bridge beginning to form across the vast distance that 3 years of separation had created. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began visiting the city periodically, careful never to overstay his welcome, or push for more than Elena was ready to offer. They spent time together slowly, rebuilding a foundation of genuine friendship, before either of them allowed themselves to consider whether something deeper might eventually be possible. Elena introduced him, cautiously, to the life she had built, including Daniel, whose friendship had settled comfortably into something platonic and supportive, as Elena worked through the complicated process of deciding what she truly wanted for her future. Grace watched this slow, careful reconciliation unfold with quiet satisfaction, having witnessed both Elena's genuine healing and Marcus's authentic transformation across 3 difficult years. "I never thought I would say this," she told Elena during one visit, "but I believe he has genuinely become someone worthy of a second chance, if that is what you decide to offer him." Elena did not rush toward any particular conclusion, understanding that genuine healing and trust could not be manufactured through urgency or desperate hope. She allowed the relationship with Marcus to develop slowly, on her own terms, testing his consistency and patience against the careful boundaries she had established for her own protection. Nearly a year after their reunion in the quiet park, Elena finally felt ready to consider what a fully reconciled bond might mean for both of them, understanding that whatever future they built together would need to honor both the painful lessons of their past and the genuine growth each of them had achieved during their years apart. She had not been rescued by Marcus's persistent efforts, and she made certain, throughout every stage of their slow reconciliation, that any eventual choice to renew their connection came from her own genuine desire, rather than obligation or pressure. In the end, whatever future unfolded between them, Elena knew she had emerged from the darkest moment of her life, having reclaimed something far more valuable than any bond or title could offer. She had reclaimed her own power, her own sense of self, built entirely through her own resilience and determination. Whatever she chose to do with Marcus's continued devotion, that reclaimed strength would remain hers alone, unshakable, regardless of whatever the future still held for either of them.